Okay, in this part of the course, I'm going to discuss color theory and going from a full palette to a limited palette. We'll also talk about value and complementary colors and all the properties of color. I'll try to summarize those. I could spend a day just talking about color and color theory, but given that we're using a limited palette, I'm just going to do most of the review just on this video, and you can go to books, and there's a whole library of information about color theory if you want more information. What I'm showing you here on the first chart is if I was using a full palette, the first row, not counting the phthalo green, would be my my primary palette. In each case, I have a red, a yellow, and a blue, a warm red, a cool red, a warm yellow, a cool yellow, a warm blue, a cool blue. In this case, in the abbreviations, this is cadmium red light, alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow medium, yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue. And I added the phthalo green to this list, first line of primary. Although it's not a primary color, it goes well with phthalo blue, and it's relatively inexpensive. And it's a way I can get a relatively cheap green without mixing something expensive like ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow medium. Now, like I said, in my primary palette, I would have in the full palette, I'd have a cool red, alizarin crimson, and a warm red, cadmium red light, a cool yellow, yellow ochre, warm yellow, cadmium yellow medium, and a cool blue, phthalo blue, and a warm blue, ultramarine blue. I could add to this palette. My second line would be more colors that I would add to this full palette. Burnt umber and burnt sienna are two colors that I'm actually going to use with the limited palette, and I'll discuss that shortly. They're browns, and they're inexpensive browns because they're made from essentially dirt and linseed oil, and they're much cheaper than what happens when you mix the three primaries. For instance, I'm showing you that down here: cadmium red light, cadmium yellow medium, and ultramarine blue. You get a warm brown. If I added the cool primaries from the first line in the alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, and phthalo blue, I'd get sort of a greenish brown. And this would look similar to some of the colors I'm showing you in the second line and third line, namely this would look sort of like raw umber. The warm brown would look sort of like tiara rose or burnt sienna. If I added more blue, I'd get something that will look more like burnt umber. So, but these, if you notice, these are expensive. Particularly this line of colors, these are all very expensive colors. And it's much easier and less expensive to just buy burnt umber and burnt sienna. And we'll discuss that when I talk about the limited palette. The other things I may or may not use are Grumbacher red, which is a pure red, lemon yellow, which is a pure yellow, Viridian green, Naples yellow I'll use occasionally for highlights in the flesh tone, and it's a lead-based dull yellow. Dioxine purple is good for some of the shadow qualities. It's a nice purple and it's relatively inexpensive. The colors you'll never probably see me talk about or use are cobalt blue, tiara rose, raw sienna, or raw umber. And you could have those on your palette, but I have them, but I rarely ever use them. Now, let's talk about what I'm going to use to do the paintings here, which is essentially a limited palette. And on a limited palette, I'm just going to have my three primaries are going to be cadmium red light, yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, plus a white, and the white's going to be permalo white. As I mentioned before, if I mix cadmium red light, yellow ochre, and ultramarine blue, I can get a brown, and depending on how much red or blue I put in it, I can darken that brown or make the brown either bluer or redder. But these are again two expensive colors, the cadmium red light and the ultramarine blue. It's much cheaper just to buy the burnt sienna and burnt umber, which are cheap browns. So I'm going to add those to my limited palette just to save on money in terms of using the more expensive primaries. But I could do everything with just these three primaries plus white. I'm showing in the third line that I could get my secondary colors if I mix the primaries. For instance, cadmium red light and yellow ochre would give me sort of a dull orange. Yellow ochre plus ultramarine blue would give me a dull green. Cadmium red light and ultramarine blue would give me sort of a dull purplish brown. And this would give me a secondary series of dull colors which you may see me mix and use in certain parts of the portrait or the figure painting. Now, my basic white flesh tone, my mid-value flesh tone is going to be made from yellow ochre, cadmium red light, and white. That gives me my number one flesh. So that's my starting flesh tone. And like I mentioned earlier, if I mix the three primaries, I can get a brown, but I'm going to substitute burnt sienna or burnt umber for that brown. And using that brown, if I mix that with ultramarine blue, I get a black. So I don't need to buy a black. I can actually mix it from any brown and basically a blue. So this is my limited palette, and this is what I'm going to use for most of the two paintings that I'm going to do for you. Now let me just give you an example of all the different flesh tones you can make from this limited palette. This is my number one flesh tone made from cadmium, red light, yellow ochre, and white. If I add more white to it, it gets duller and lighter. If I add black to it, made from burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, if I add a little bit, it dulls the flesh tone and makes it darker. And as I add more, it gets darker, darker, browner, and goes to a gray. And then I could basically add white to each one of these, and I get a lighter version of that color. So you can see all the different flesh tones. Like, again, this is just one example of all the variety of flesh tones I can get. And essentially, I can mix any flesh tone just from this limited palette. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to review it again here, is essentially color has a value. Value means how light or dark it is. Our value scale goes from black to white, and then we have a gray scale of various different values in between. And paint right out of the tube has a value. The phthalo colors, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, and phthalo green are towards the dark side. A lot of these are towards either the mid-value range, a little bit towards the dark side. You got a couple, the yellows are more or less in the mid-range, but towards the white, towards the lighter side. You can color also, in addition to value, it can be bright, like cadmium red light, or dull, like alizarin crimson. It could be warm or cool. Cadmium yellow medium would be warm, yellow ochre would be cool, cadmium red light would be warm, alizarin crimson would be cool, ultramarine blue would be warm, phthalo blue would be cool. It also could have property of either be transparent or opaque. Alizarin crimson would be transparent, yellow ochre would be opaque. And with these properties you could do things called glazing and scumbling. Glazing is when you drag a transparent color like alizarin crimson over a dried underpainting, and what happens is the underpainting will show through and it gives depth and certain types of color properties to the painting. And this is a trick that I'll probably use at the end as a final tuning of the portrait or the figure painting. There's another, the opposite of glazing is something called scumbling, which is just the opposite. Instead of dragging something transparent, you take something opaque like yellow ochre or white, and then you drag that across dried underpainting and you let the paint break. And that gives you, again, it's a certain type of technique that's used in terms of the finishing details of the paintings, particularly in the case that we're going to do here for either the portrait or the figure. Now finally, the last thing I want to mention is complementary colors. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that I'm going to use this in both figure and portrait paintings, in that the backgrounds are always going to be a complement to the flesh tone. The flesh tone is towards the reddish or yellow, so the background will either be bluish or purplish gray, or it might be a greenish gray if I use red, a lot of red in the flesh tones. And complementary colors are basically opposite on a color wheel. For instance, red and green, orange and blue, yellow and purple. And if you take a complement, you take a little bit of the green, you mix it in with the red. This is a Grumbacher red, a pure red, and this would be a pure green, an emerald green. What happens is you dull the red down and you make it darker and it goes towards a brown. Same thing's true with the orange and with the yellow. You add a little bit of blue into the orange, you dull it down and make it darker and it goes towards a brown, and same thing with the yellow. Now the reason for this is that I'm actually adding the three primers together in each case, because the green contains yellow and blue, the orange contains red and yellow, and the purple contains red and blue. So in every case When I add the complements together, I'm adding three primaries together, so they're always going to go towards a brown, some sort of a brown. Now finally, a trick that I'm going to use, particularly to draw your attention to the focal point of the figure of the face, is something called simultaneous contrast. It was originally used by the classical painters in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, where they would surround a very light color by a darker color. That darker color would influence the light color and make it look lighter and brighter. So you can actually see this if you put a light figure on a dark background. It's going to make that figure look brighter and pop out more than if you put that same figure on a light background or a mid-tone background. The other trick that I'll use is something that the Impressionists did in the 19th century. They realized they could do the same thing with complementary colors. That is, if I surround an orange by a blue, the orange will appear brighter and essentially lighter than if I surround the orange by a green or some other color that's not its complement. So you're going to hear me mention these little tricks towards the end of the paintings as I fine-tune them. And they're all very useful things to know. And this is really just a very quick summary of color theory. Like I said, if you want more extensive information, just go to any book on color theory. The final thing is this little brush that I've been using as a pointer is something called a rigger. And you may or may not see me use this at the very end of a painting to do some really fine details like the eyes or the fingers or something like that. And it's a useful brush to have. For beginners, I would say stay away from it because you'd really want to stay away from thinking about detail. Certainly at the beginning or through most of the painting. It's just at the very end you may want to put a few details in. Thinking about details at the beginning usually is something that will actually destroy a painting. You really want to think about the painting as a whole and always try to use an oversized brush to stay away from using details. And that pretty much summarizes color theory, and the next thing we're going to do is get into the paintings.